Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Eyeshadow and Etihaas. And I am wearing my favorite color today, lilac. After that absolutely random TMI, for those of you who are watching me for the first time and have no idea who I am Ruchika Sharma. I teach history for a living, and I'm also pursuing my doctorate in history from the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Previously, I've also done my Masters and MPhil in History from the Center for Historical Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. For those of you who are new to the channel and have not seen episode 1 and episode 2 of Eyeshadow and Etihaas, I have linked it in the description box as well as up here. Please note, if whatever I say here today sparks your curiosity on the subject, then there is a list of sources that I have written in the description box that you can use either for a bit of an extra reading or to fact check everything I blabber over here. Now that all that is sorted, let me introduce you to today's topic. Today we will talk about Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, an absolutely fascinating entity. So much is written about him, yet the man manages to remain an enigma. Depending on what source you read, Ashok is either a ruthless conqueror, a monk or a monarch, an astute politician, and even the flag bearer of Ahimsa. Ashok's example is a teachable moment in the study of history, one that proves that characters or events in history are inevitably tied to their source. But how does one make sense of sources? Especially for Ashok, whose sources are so diverse, they range from political to religious, with lots of 20th century Indian nationalism thrown in for dramatic effect. We will try to achieve this in two parts. Part 1 will talk about Ashok in the Buddhist tradition, while Part 2 will discuss his edicts as well as 20th century nationalist historiography. The idea of this two-part series is less to know about Ashok and more to understand how sources in history are sifted to separate fact from fiction. Of course, the difference is not always this stark, especially when we're dealing with a time period where the conception or the idea of history is vastly different from how we understand history today. But historians have nonetheless worked tirelessly to understand the Mauryan emperor, who once sang, "Roshni se bhare bhare, bhare bhare, naina tere." History is hard work, you guys. Even though Ashok's most contemporary sources are his edicts, the first part of this series is dedicated to understanding the Buddhist tradition vis-a-vis Ashok, primarily because Ashok's popular image today is that of a Buddhist king who embraced non-violence thanks to Buddhism after a life of absolute debauchery. Was he all that? More importantly, if he wasn't all that, why did the Buddhist monk resurrect his memory as such? What's in it for them? But most importantly, how does a historian comprehend all this? Let's try and figure all of this out while doing this lilac eye makeup. Chale phir? The Buddhist tradition on Ashok can be roughly divided into two. One is the Sanskrit canon, with Ashoka Vadan being the main text, which influenced even Chinese pilgrims and travelers such as Fahian and Hyunsa. The other is the Pali canon, with texts such as Mahavamsha and Deepavamsha leading the fore. Let's first discuss the Ashoka Vadan. Now, the Ashoka Vadan was written in the 2nd century CE, which is roughly around 400 years after the death of Emperor Ashok. In the text, even before we are presented with the emperor himself, we are told of his past life, his Punarjanam, where he was born as Jaya, a boy born in the city of Rajgir, which was at that point of time the capital of Magad. Now Jaya, of course, bumps into the Buddha himself and offers him some dirt. Offerings in the Buddhist tradition are never to be given alone. They are often to be accompanied by a wish, which is to be often made by the donee. Jaya, no marks for guessing, wishes to become a king. A king who would one day pay his respect to the Buddha. Played it big, Jaya. Smart move. Now the Buddha is of course impressed by Jaya's resolve and grants him the wish. Later on, he announces to his disciple Ananda that Jaya would be reborn as Ashok in Patliputra and would go on to become a Dharmaraj and a Chakravartin king. Chakravartin, of course, being the mythical concept of a universal ruler. Interesting, this prophecy, but also quite common. Legends surrounding kings or saints have often capitalized on this trope of a prophetic past life or a prophetic birth, one that was told generations ago. In fact, many such legends came up for the Buddha's birth himself. The core part of the story is, of course, tying Ashok's fame and his well-established stature as a ruler with the Buddhist tradition. The idea is quite clearly to show that Ashok became great partly by his own merits, but also because of Buddha's blessings. The other interesting set of stories in the Ashoka Vadan are related to Ashok's early life, where he is described as Chand Ashok or fierce Ashok. Now Chand Ashok, the Ashoka Vadan informs us, was of unpleasant appearance. Yeah, whatever that means. And this is why our Ashok fails to earn his father's love or approval. Yet, his father's appointed fortune teller immediately recognizes Ashok as the rightful heir of Bindusar, but says nothing because, Bindusar hates Ashok. And Bindusar is the king. You ain't crossing the king like that. Fascinatingly, this fortune teller was an Ajivika, a sect that was considered close to Ashok's mother, Dharma. Shubhadrangi? Durdhara? We don't know. She's referred to in texts by many names. Now, Ajivikas were a fatalist sect where everything is written in the stars and your efforts mean nothing. Interestingly, despite what the Buddhist sources would have us believe about Ashok's love for Buddhism, the Mauryan emperor was a generous donee to the Ajivika sect. This cave in Bihar was donated to the Ajivikas and was hewn out of a single gigantic granite rock. And the insides were polished. He spent money on them. Oh yes, he did. How do we know this? He put an inscription on the cave. But we're saving the inscriptions for part 2, so I'll say no more. Ashoka Vadan further weaves the story that it wasn't easy for Ashok to get to the throne, since the heir apparent was his half-brother Sushil. But Chand Ashok used all his wrath and cruelty to eliminate all forms of competition. His fierceness in the Ashoka Vadan comes across as almost mindless. In one instance, Ashok orders his ministers to axe down flower and fruit trees instead of the thorn trees. When the ministers objected, 500 of them were killed for displaying disloyalty to the crown. Yikes. In another instance, the Ashoka Vadan tells us that the emperor burned 500 women of his harem on account of some trick they played on him. What's with 500? It's always 500. The worst instance of Ashok was his creation of a hell, which he created with the help of his able executioner, a man called Girika. Yes, they're both Chand, that's why they're friends. Before he was recruited, Girika's fierceness was tested by Ashok's men, who gave him only one interview question. Can you be the emperor's able executioner? And Girika, like every other Enthu interviewee who really wants the job proclaimed, I can kill the whole of Jambudvipa. Noble thoughts, sir. Noble thoughts. You're hired. Interviews in Jambudvipa be this simple. Somebody take me back to Jambudvipa. Which reminds me, Jambudvipa, as a geographical term, largely referred to the territory ruled by the Mauryan emperor, but is also a term used in a wider sense to mean most of the subcontinent in both Buddhist and Brahmanical traditions. Once recruited, Girika would prove to be really good at his job. The hell created by Emperor Ashok would seem innocent and even quite aesthetic, usually to entice passerbys who would willingly wander off into the building and would then be executed by Girika after many a torment, which the text describes pretty graphically. Pouring red-hot iron into their open mouths, chiseling out their intestines. Ugh! Real ID se aao jaagte re par. Sorry. That's just my true crime infested mind. But note that the Ashoka Vadan left no stone unturned in depicting Ashok as a thoroughly sadistic and utterly cruel ruler who would kill just to kill. Now this was of course a really good setting of stage. A stage that would eventually display the conversion of a thoroughly monstrous man and ruler. Now in this hell walks Samudra, a Buddhist monk who by his faith to the religion is able to retain his composure even through his torment and displays excellent magic, which of course stuns Girika, who calls Ashok to witness the miracle. Now Ashok gets thoroughly interested by these jaw-dropping feats that Samudra achieves effortlessly and asks what's his secret. Samudra reveals that he follows the path of the Buddha and Dharma. He also reminds Ashok of Buddha's prophecy, where Ashok would be a Dharmaraj. Ashok's taken in by the philosophy and the prophecy, and of course has a change of heart. The hell is broken down and Girika is executed. Ashok then proceeds to distribute the relics of the Buddha in 84,000 different locations, building a stupa on each one of them. 84,000 stupa in total. When he finishes the task, he is heralded as Dharma Ashok or Dhamma Ashok, the righteous Ashok. Now this Ashok is the complete opposite of his earlier Chanda version. This one goes to pilgrimage to all the sites associated with Buddhism instead of randomly killing people. He organizes banquets for the Buddhist bhikkhus or bhikkhunis, basically the monks and the nuns of the Buddhist monastic order. He organizes the banquets for the Buddhist bhikkhus and bhikkhunis every 5 years. He makes plenty donations, including donating the Jambudvip itself 3 times and then buying it back 3 times with his own money. Our boy changed overnight. Power of Buddhism. The Ashoka Vadan clearly had a major impact, and this Avadan of Ashok, this legend, was told and retold in several different versions. Fascinatingly, the the tale travelled to China, where it was called Yu Wang Shuang. I'm clearly not pronouncing it right, so I'm just gonna write it here. As well as to Kashmir, where it was called the Avadana Kalapalata. Now the Chinese travellers to the subcontinent, such as Fahian coming in the 5th century CE and Hyun coming in the 7th century CE, were both quite familiar with the Chinese version of the Ashoka Vadan. Both of these Chinese travellers in their travelogues report that they came across a pillar inscription of Ashok at Patliputra, which was basically the capital city of the Mauryan Empire under Ashok, where Ashok mentions how he donated the whole of Jambudweep 3 times and bought it back thrice over. Of course, the legend is from Ashoka Vadan, but archaeologists have confirmed to us that no such Ashokan pillar alludes to anything even remotely close to the Mauryan emperor ever donating the Jambudweepa. Furthermore, it is highly unlikely that either one of them even knew how to read the Brahmi script, but it made for a nice story anyway. Now, before we raise pertinent questions on the Ashoka Vadan, let's first briefly discuss another text, Mahavamsha, a Ceylonese chronicle written in Pali in the 5th century CE, depicting the lives of many kings associated with the Buddhist tradition, including Ashok. Ceylon, of course, was the ancient name of Sri Lanka. In terms of depicting Ashok's pre-Buddhist life, the Mahavamsha is a lot more sedate than the Ashoka Vadan. The Mauryan emperor's cruelty here is largely depicted through his wars of succession, where he is said to have slaughtered 99 of his stepbrothers. The Mahavamsha tells us that Ashok once saw a Buddhist monk walking down the street, and the emperor was so impressed by that man's peaceful demeanor that he invited him in and asked him to sit down. Now, our peaceful Buddhist monk went and sat on the throne. Because obviously, the Buddhist monk is above Ashok. Not just because he's a Buddhist, but mostly because he's a monk. You'll see how highly respected monks were in the Buddhist tradition. Sitting on the throne, this Buddhist monk lectures Ashok on basic tenets of Buddhism. More specifically on apamad, which is basically diligence, a form of mindfulness in the Buddhist tradition. Ashok's impressed and converts to Buddhism. One of the first things he does post that is to take care of the monks by feeding them. See how important they are? The idea that Ashok took care of the monks refers to him having extended a generous patronage towards the Buddhist Sangha, the Buddhist monastic order, which the Mahavamsa informs us causes many non-Buddhists to enter the Sangha. Now you would think that's a good thing, right? Buddhist Sangha gets patronage, more people convert, enter the Sangha, Buddhism grows? Nope. The Mahavamsa tells us that it was a terrible thing, since the new entrants were tempted more by the patronage and less by their faith in the Buddhist Sangha. This stopped the Uposatha ceremony for 7 long years. Uposatha is basically an assembly of the monks held regularly to reaffirm their faith in the Theravada Buddhist tradition. Now, unable to independently solve this problem, Ashok invites the Buddhist monk Tissa Mughaliputta. And with his help, Ashok purifies the Sangha of around 60,000 bhikkhus or Buddhist monks. By expelling them, of course. Ashok doesn't kill even once after he's converted. Now that the Sangha was cleansed, Uposatha was resumed. He then organizes the Third Buddhist Council, Kissa also told Ashok about the relics of Buddha, which caused the emperor to have 84,000 viharas built in his empire. Viharas are, of course, monasteries. The Ceylonese chronicle also introduces Ashok's love affair with Devi, a stunning beauty that Ashok met even before he became king. It was love at first sight, we are told. I don't know if it was. You can't fact check love. Interestingly, the chronicle doesn't mention Devi being married to Ashok. Only the word samvas is mentioned, which is the Sanskrit word for what you do to get babies. I can't say the S word, you guys. YouTube will downgrade me. The samvas, of course, leads to the birth of Mahinda, the son, and Sangamitta, the daughter. Two very important characters, as both of them were given away by Ashok to the Sangha. Ashok's story in the Buddhist tradition gained immense popularity, you guys. Kings in Sri Lanka banned animal slaughter. In 5th century China, the Buddhist emperor Lian Yudhai went and lived in a monastery with monks. The 19th century Sri Lankan Buddhist missionary Angarika Dharmapala regarded Ashok's empire to be democratic, while the 20th century Sri Lankan writer D.C. Vijayavardhan regarded Ashok to be the Lenin of Buddhism. I have no idea what that means. Clearly, Ashok has made it. But who is this Ashok? Is this Ashok the statesman? Or Ashok the person? Or is this Ashok just a figment of the Buddhist monk's imagination? How do we make sense of the Buddhist tradition of Ashok? The first thing to do is to contextualize, you guys. That's the name of the game in history. Context, contextualize, contextualization. These are some very important words. Now, literally, context means to put something in the situation in which it happens. Historical context basically means to put something in the time period in which it happens, or in the socio-cultural milieu in which it happens, or in the genre in which it was produced. You get the point. We will now contextualize the two, the Pali and the Sanskrit Buddhist tradition of Ashok, in their time period and their genre. First, the time. The Ashoka Vadan was written in the 2nd century CE and the Mahavamsha was written in the 5th century CE. While both of them deviate on many plot points, one of the things that's common between the two is the lack of precise dating. We don't know when Ashok was born. We don't know when he died. There is certainly a sense of time though. The Ashoka Vadan says that Ashoka was born 100 years after the death of Buddha, while the Mahavamsha claims that it was 218 years after the death of Buddha that Ashoka was coronated. Now that's not only two very different time frames, but they also lack precision. In order to figure out when Ashoka was born, you'll first have to figure out when Buddha attained the Mahaparinirvana. Basically, when the Buddha died. Now this frame of reference, that is the Buddha's death, in itself has no precise dating. Scholars date Buddha's death to be somewhere around 480 to 400 BCE. Why is there no precise dating? Contextualizing these texts in their time period reveals that they were written at a time when the subcontinent had no major development of a historical biographical tradition. Now, precise dates during this time period are few and far between, primarily due to an underdeveloped sense of chronology and history. This sense of chronology and history, however, will get sharpened with time. such as in Harsha's biography written by Banabhatta. Harsha, of course, was a 7th century king of the subcontinent. This sense of chronology in history would become even better with the coming of the Tariq literature, which was brought to the subcontinent by the Turks. Now, the Tariq literature not only records events and their corresponding dates according to the Hijri calendar quite meticulously, but it also introduces into the subcontinent a very robust sense of causal relationships, which is basically the relationship between an event and its cause. Now, while causal relationships, as Romila Thapar tells us, did exist in the literature which is being produced even before the Tariq tradition comes in, these causal relationships are not exactly rational causal relationships. Here, the causes for events are often attributed to karma or divine retribution. Basically, the causal relationships are firmly rooted in religion, and time, at best, is only relational. Now, our Mauryan Emperor Ashok himself, in his famous edicts, only mentions time in terms of his regnal years, with no frame of reference for a start date, such as the year of his accession. In fact, the date of Ashok's accession to the throne has been deduced by historians from the date of one of his contemporaries, the Seleucid ruler Antiochus Theos. Now for the genre, neither of these is a strictly historical biography, considering that genre had not developed at all. Ashoka Vadan is an Avadan text, which is basically a legendary narrative of the religious deeds of an individual, while the Mahavamsha is a Vamsha text, where Vamsha literally means lineage or chronicle, and the text as such chronicles the sacred story of a region or a sect. Now, in this regard, Ashoka Vadan focuses solely on Ashok, while in the Mahavamsha, Ashok is one of the many important links between Buddhism in Sri Lanka and Buddhism in India. This is why Devi is mentioned only in the Sri Lankan chronicles, because it is her and Ashok's progeny, Mahinda, who is sent to Sri Lanka as a Buddhist missionary. Her other child, Sanghamitra, is also sent to Sri Lanka in order to start the order of nuns or the order of the Bhikkhunis in Sri Lanka. Now, this is also why the Ashoka Vadan is such a dramatic text, since the Avadan genre is a dramatic one, where the storyline promises to be extremely entertaining. But what about the actual content? It requires absolutely no special skill set to note that Ashok's pre-Buddhist portraiture in both these texts is excessively negative, while his post-conversion self is excessively positive. Now, the interregnum is provided by Buddhism and its teachings. The idea is quite clear. Buddhism is such a powerful rescuing force that it led to a change of heart in the worst of people, Chandashok. Now, the exaggeration is not only required for an interesting storyline, but for a full effect display of Buddhism being a force to reckon with. The point was never to tell you who Ashok was. The point was always to tell you who Ashok was for Buddhism. Whether Dhamma Ashok or a purifier of the Sangha post-conversion, Ashoka in the Buddhist tradition is only a Buddhist king. Now, does this mean that there are no facts at all in these two texts? Not at all. The Ashoka Vadan mentions the Ajivikas, a sect which in today's world is completely extinct, considering it has no followers. The Ashoka Vadan, therefore, not only preserves the traditions of the Ajivikas, but also highlights their importance during the Mauryan period. Additionally, both these texts get Ashok's conversion right. It is beyond a doubt that Ashok converted to Buddhism. He writes it in his edicts. But the hows and whys of the conversion are completely shrouded in mystery. The Kalinga War seems to have been an important event in Ashok's life, as he mentions in his edicts. But the war is not mentioned in any of these texts, primarily since the war in no way contributes to the larger storyline. Buddhism reformed a powerful and terrible ruler. But most of all, these texts are important sources for the social history of their time and region. Like all good works of fiction, they are firmly rooted in the social milieu of their time. They may not always pass the fact check, but they depict their society, its traditions, mores, customs, quite well. In fact, works of fiction are always regarded as a good source of social history, since no fiction ever comes in a vacuum. The notions of good and bad, the social hierarchies, are often a reflection of the society in which these stories were produced in. Lastly, we cannot use these texts in isolation. While we have established that the Buddhist texts use Ashok as an example to show the might of Buddhism, did Ashok also use Buddhism in his edicts to acquire some form of legitimacy? How much can we relate Ashok's famous policy of Dhamma to the idea of Dhamma in Buddhist texts? During Ashok's time, Buddhism was a widespread movement, which had a huge impact on the social ideas and personal beliefs of that time. Did Ashok, like any other astute politician, take cognizance of this in order to consolidate his rule? His edicts are a rare source. They are his voice. But are they the voice of Ashok the statesman or Ashok the person? How does an emperor, knowing fully well that his edicts will be read far and wide, cause his edicts to be written? They are contemporary to Ashok's time, but how reliable are his edicts? For all his fascinating tales of piety and legends of power, Ashok was quite quickly forgotten, primarily because Buddhism as a religion dwindled in its following. His edicts, written in Brahmi, Kharoshti as well as the Aramaic script, were no longer legible. It would be quite a while before Ashok would be remembered again. This time as the pioneer of Ahimsa and the scion of Indian history, at a time when India was battling its colonial masters. How did that impact Ashok's history? All of that in the next part of the series. And that is all that I have for you today. Please note that if any of this interests you, there is a list of sources mentioned in the description box that you can read to know more about Ashok's history. Also note, this is only the first part in the two-part series that we are having on Ashok. And before you just walk away, please like and share the video and subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the next part.